Hey there, fellow chess goons. My name is Anthony Arena. I am a chess expert from Long Island, New York. And today we're going to go over the seven most important checkmate patterns that every single chess player must know. Some of these positions can be a little bit more complicated than others, so I highly recommend taking the time on each position, making sure you understand it before going to the next part. Without further ado, let's begin. So the first position here is called a back rank checkmate. And this is one of the most common checkmates that you will find in chess. I want you to notice that it is marked by when these three pawns here are blocking the king in. Normally, this is an extremely safe position, and you want your pawns to be structured like this, but sometimes it will lead to a back rank checkmate. Notice our opponent is up 12 points of material, but despite this, we have a checkmate pattern because the king will not be able to escape if we issue check on e8. The only problem is the rook is here defending that square. However, our rook is defending the queen. So after queen to e8, brilliant sacrifice. The rook is forced to take back. There's no other moves available. And this position, rook takes rook, e8, checkmate, and the king cannot escape. Position number two, and this is my favorite, the smothered mate. This is one of the most fancy tactics in all of chess, and it's defined by when both the knight and the queen have access to this f7 square, and the king has these two pawns blocking his escape. You don't need the f7 pawn blocked, and I'll show you why right now. In this situation, we automatically have queen to e6, checking the king. Notice that in this way, if the king goes to f8, queen f7, checkmate on the spot. That's pretty basic, but king to h8. And this seems completely safe. Notice we can't go for our back rank checkmate because not one, but two rooks are defending e8. But we do have knight check. There are no pieces hitting the knight, and the king is forced to go back to g8. After king to g8, we have an extremely fancy, brilliant move, knight to h6, check with the queen, check with the knight. Notice in this way, the pawn on g7 cannot take the knight back because the king is double checked. There's a check here and a check here, and you have to defend both threats. The only way to do that is to go to king f8 or king h8. But as we know, king f8 is checkmate in one. So king h8 is forced. And now we have the finishing brilliant touch to an absolutely amazing checkmate pattern. We have queen to g8. And in this position, the king cannot take the queen back. The rook must take. And if the rook takes, we have knight f7, smothered mate. The king is nowhere to go and he is in check. Nothing is attacking the knight. And that is game over. Checkmate number three, Grecos Mate. And this is another extremely fancy and difficult mate to find. I want you to know as a common theme in all of these mating patterns is the king is restricted. Not only is our king blocked behind h7 and g7 and cannot escape, but this bishop on b3 is further restricting the king's movement to g8, forcing the king to pretty much be stuck in place. Then you have to ask yourself a fundamental question. Well, if this pawn wasn't here, wouldn't rook to h1 be checkmate? And the answer is yes. In this way, the king would have nowhere to go and there's nothing to block the check. So it's just checkmate. Take it one step further now. Knight to g6 checks the king. And notice in this way, the king cannot go to g8, cannot move at all. And h takes g is forced. And this actually creates a side rank. Rook h1 and it's checkmate. And the bishop is blocking b8. So there's nowhere to go. Game over. For checkmate number four, Anastasias Mate, we can use a very similar tactic as in Grecos Mate. Notice that once again, the king actually doesn't have many squares to go to after knight to e7. In fact, there's only one choice here, king to h8. Now, we know that the knight is blocking g8, but it's also blocking off the very important g6 square. And you might ask, well, why exactly is g6 so important to block? Well, think about it like this. Once again, if the pawn here on h7 didn't exist, it would be a side rank, right? Queen h1, and there would be nowhere to go because the knight is blocking both of these squares. So then we ask ourselves the question, is there something we can do to actually force the issue and get checkmate on the spot? Well, the queen is pointing down h7, but it sounds a little too crazy, except this actually does work. Queen takes pawn, And the king is forced to take back. Obviously, there's nowhere else to go. And now look at this. Knight blocks g6, knight blocks g8, and the rook slides over to h1. And we have a side rank. Anastasias Mate, an absolutely beautiful performance here. Okay, but guys, let's go to the big leagues with checkmate number 5, Bodens Mate. And Bodens Mate really highlights the strength of two bishops. Many people feel as though the knights are stronger than bishops, but you can see right here that these bishops can actually win the game for you. Notice that the king's restriction is evident. The dark squares are under our control. And you think to yourself, well, is there any way to get a check on the king? Well, there's one check on the board right now, queen c6. But of course, the pawn just takes back. But interestingly enough, our bishop can actually create an attack on the light squares. And in this way, we actually have a checkmate in 2 moves. Queen takes c6. Notice that this is a forced move. The king is in check. There's nowhere else to go. There's no other way to block. The pawn must take back and then slide bishop to a6. Checkmate. And it looks unbelievable, but the king really has nowhere else to go. And this knight cannot defend b7. This rook is trapped. It's just game over. Checkmate pattern number 6. Blackburnes Mate actually employs a similar tactic with 2 bishops, with one bishop in particular, the b2 dark square bishop, blocking the king's mobility. And in this position, you actually have to think a little bit deeper here because there's no immediate mates on the board. However, we can threaten mates. Even without knowing much about chess, you can figure out that the king has nowhere to go, and h7 is a serious weakness only defended by the king. Sliding the queen over to h1 is the natural move here. Notice that we are now threatening mate on h7, and a very natural idea would be to play h5. And really, there's nothing else that can be done because the king's mobility is completely lost. If the rook moves over to, let's say, e8, queen check, king moves over, and then mate. So there's not many options for avoiding mate in 2. So, of course, we play h5. A trick I learned about chess is that sometimes you should look at every single move on the board, even if it doesn't look realistic. And one move you might find is queen takes pawn. And this does look absolutely dubious because the pawn just takes back. But actually, once again, this dark square bishop blocks off the king's mobility, and we can slide bishop to h7, which would be checkmate, game over. So here we go. Queen takes. And also note that if you don't take the pawn back, the queen is going to slide into h8 and mate you. So you have to take. And that gives us an absolutely beautiful bishop h7, the knight's defending the bishop, the dark square bishop's covering all of these squares, and there's just nowhere to go. It's checkmate, game over. Last but certainly not least, Lolli's Mate. And Lolli's Mate is an extremely famous tactic that you must know. Notice in this position, the queen is going to look to play queen h6 and mate on g7. This is a typical idea. The king moves over, though, and plays king h8, looking to cut the rook here and defend. That is completely fine with us. We will go ahead and move the queen over to h6. And notice we are threatening g7 mate. The rook must come to g8 to defend, and this actually suffocates the king. Notice that this pawn on f6 perfectly blocks the g7 square. And if we can just get this pawn out of the way, it would be checkmate. Of course, queen takes g6 doesn't work because there are 3 different pieces that can take. This pawn does not take. For example, rook takes or pawn takes, and now we've just lost the queen. However, we can go right to the source, queen h7, and a common theme that we're going to end this off with, side rank, checkmate, game over. Overall, guys, those are the 7 most important checkmates that every chess player should know. If there's one thing you take from this video, keep in mind how we take advantage of the king's lack of mobility. When the king has less spaces to move to, you should think, how can I attack the king? If you guys enjoyed these checkmates today, I highly recommend you check out the greatest checkmate of all time. Other than that, stay classy, my friends. I'll see you around.